a little bit self-conscious at producing a top 10 Castlevania games video. It feels like I'm still not really a super hardcore fan because there's still lots of games in the series I haven't played, particularly the 64 games and Rondo of Blood. There are like little bits of odds and ends, but I've played enough now where the Castlevania games that I genuinely love are over 10. So I thought it is about time, with the recent releases of all these great Castlevania collections, to look back on my 10 favorites. These are the top 10 best Castlevania games. Who would have thought that we would have gotten a brand new Castlevania game in 2024? Yeah, it's a remake of an older title, but I went ahead and went back and played the original Haunted Castle and found it to be slow, boring, unintuitive. I'm sure it was great for the time, but I found myself very surprised at just how well made and engaging Haunted Castle Revisited was on the Castlevania Dominus Collection. Haunted Castle Revisited is everything we like about really old school NES Castlevania, right? Side scrolling action, great boss fights, amazing sprite work, great gloomy atmosphere. It was just really fun throughout the entire playthrough. And considering the difficulty and the fact that you can beat it in one sitting, and because of the unlimited continues, this very well may be the best possible way to get into old school classic Castlevania today. So if you're interested in checking out both amazing Igavania titles and a classic title, the Dominus Collection would be a wonderful place to start. There's a lot to like about Castlevania Bloodlines. It really sticks out compared to other Castlevania games around that period, right? You have multiple playable characters, you have this globe-trotting adventure, you have this really groovy soundtrack. The game really goes out of its way to have really different level design, like both in aesthetics and in general structure. And the bosses are a little bit different, right? You end up fighting sorcerers, and the death fight is a little bit differently than it normally is. Like Castlevania Bloodlines, to me, seems like a title that was produced to try and freshen up the traditional Castlevania formula. As great as Super Castlevania 4 was, it was technically a remake of the original. Bloodlines was something new, original, and different, and that's what gives the game its unique charm. Although nowhere near the quality of its predecessor, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow really does do a lot right. It does have a lot of interesting ideas. It recaptures a lot of what made Aria fantastic. It does have some really interesting mechanics and some features and some boss fights, multiple bad endings, and being able to see Soma again is really cool. But again, it is a rather middling sequel of honestly the greatest Castlevania game of all time. So for that reason, a lot of people tend to come away with it feeling kind of disappointed, but it is really hard to deny that Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow is a genuinely good game in its own right. It has some really interesting set pieces, great boss designs, great environments. This was the first Castlevania game on the DS, after all. So this was them working with new technology and figuring things out and experimenting and trying to decide what they wanted to do with the subsequent games. And you can see elements of that in Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia, right? Dawn of Sorrow seems simultaneously like it was playing it a little bit too safe and taking too many risks, right? In a lot of ways, this is one of the lesser Igavanias, but it does maintain a certain amount of quality that makes it very, very hard to disrespect. There is absolutely no getting away from the iconic original. From the legendary sprite work, the great music, the unusual gothic atmosphere, Castlevania won a ton of attention from gamers upon its debut. It was probably one of the most hardcore games on NES because of its themes and its ideas, right? The idea that you were a vampire hit killer on a quest to destroy the evil Dracula, who, rather than just being some guy who sits in a castle waiting for you to be killed, has legions of powerful monsters at his command, right? You go through these stages battling bats, and all these other number of creatures, right? Zombies are everywhere, all these crazy boss creatures, and at the end you are rewarded with the first in a long line of iconic fights with the Count himself, right? Castlevania is a really interesting video game franchise because it establishes such a strong tradition right off the bat. You know, a lot of elements introduced in this first game carry over not only to the direct sequels, you know, 2 and 3, 4, and like you know the classic Vania games, but in the Igavania ones. The games, it's kind of shocking to see the events of this title referenced in Harmony Dissonance or other Castlevania games. Like, Konami paid an unusual adherence to established continuity and lore when making these games, and as a result of it, a lot of it comes off as very cohesive and natural. And a big reason for that is because the original set the stage for what was to come very, very beautifully. For most people, Castlevania Symphony of the Night would probably be number one or number two at the very least, right? To see it come so low kind of speaks volumes about how I feel about it. Yes, I love the music. Yes, I love the artwork. Yes, I love the fact that it established the Igavania genre. This marked the genre shift from the classic style action platforming classic Vanias to the more modern Metroid-like action RPG Igavanias, right? Again, this game has a lot of significance culturally among gamers. This is the origin of Dracula's infamous like "What is a man?" speech. You know, the wine glass throw. You have all this iconic iconography. You know, some great lines, great pieces of music, right? The game is a classic in a lot of in many senses of the word, but in a lot of ways, its follow-ups do a lot better than it, right? The game feels really unbalanced. It's really easy to get the best equipment and just kind of steamroll through the second half of the game. The bosses are uninspired in a lot of cases. Some things are unintuitive and don't really make a whole lot of sense. The voice acting can be considered poor, right? The game does hold up very, very well, but it is a far cry from what you'll experience from Super Metroid or other games in the Igavania lineup, right? Symphony of the Night set a great template for what was to come, and there are definitely things to like about it, but by and large, the title just doesn't quite live up to its own hype. Castlevania Circle of the Moon is a very overlooked title. I think because it comes sandwiched in between the iconic Symphony and the iconic later Igavanias, right? This was the first entry on the Game Boy Advance. It doesn't look good. It makes a ton of changes. You're not even playing as a Belmont, right? You are playing a game imitating the Igavania style, not made by Iga, that has a lot of really weird changes to the formula, right? You can't even run at the beginning of the game, right? So Circle of the Moon would be very easy to overlook for a lot of people, but once you actually get through it, once you actually play the game, you find like the game has a really good combat system, really good sense of progression, a really unique card system in which you can get wildly different powers depending on what cards you get and how you apply them to your character. And the bosses are just spectacular, right? Circle of the Moon, I think, really steps up its game from Symphony of the Night because it really understands that you are in a dangerous castle filled with monsters and dangerous environments, right? Unlike Symphony of the Night, which you can kind of breeze through, Circle of the Moon takes a lot of preparation, a lot of skill, a lot of talent, and playing through it is an absolute delight. Even though it's aged rather poorly, right? The sprite work is atrocious. The game for hardcore Castlevania fans is absolutely worth checking out. It's really odd looking back and seeing the sheer amount of YouTubers who tried to trash Super Castlevania 4. It's too easy. You can whip in all four directions. Like, you can choose through the entire game. Yeah, that's what makes it good. Okay? Like, Super Castlevania 4 really improved the combat system of the first three games. Right? No longer are you relegated to simply awkwardly like attacking left or right. You can now attack in all directions. And it's so much fun and so satisfying. And you can use your whip for a lot of other things too, namely swinging on grapples and hitting torches from at any angle. It's so satisfying to use. I never get tired of attacking things in this game. And yet Ego Raptor wants to sit there and tell me that like, oh, the game is lesser because it's easy. Like to me, I think Super Castlevania 4 is easier than the NES games, but that doesn't necessarily make it a worse game. If anything, it really demonstrates just how there's more to good game design than simply being difficult. To me, like Castlevania 4 has way more organic environments, way better music, better combat encounters, great boss fights, wonderful sprite work, great memorable moments, an iconic ending. Like to me, Super Castlevania 4 is one of the very best games on Super Nintendo. To me, this is not a game I grew up with. This is a game that I learned to love as I got older. But the more time I spend with it, the more I realize that this game is a bona fide classic and by far the best of the classic Vanias. To me, the only one that could possibly come close is Rondo of Blood, but unfortunately, I have not had the pleasure of playing it yet. So until I get my hands on Rondo of Blood, this is the absolute best classic Vania I have ever played. Oh man, it hurts so much. It stings. I hate this. Putting my girl Shanoa at number 3, but this is just a testament to just how strong the first two are, right? Like this isn't me like downplaying Order of Ecclesia or its accomplishments at all, right? It was a stellar way to end the series. It was a really good title that really deserved a lot more appreciation and respect when it was brand new. Order of Ecclesia was an absolute masterpiece. And even today really impresses me with its boss design, with its general structure, with its creativity, and especially with its female lead, who I can't stop gushing over whenever I start talking about the game. The game just plain rules. And if they had been allowed to continue this unique blend of Classic Vania and Egavania, we possibly would have gotten this brand new style of Castlevania game that really would have made Shanoa just a household name in video games. But unfortunately, it never happened because Konami. But the game really, really does impress in so many ways. It's really hard to like think about what could have been when you have what's actually there. And what you actually have is the tightest combat system in any Castlevania game. Some of the best boss fights in any Castlevania game, right? Some of the best background art and area design in any Castlevania game, right? You actually go outside the castle in this one, much like Bloodlines. But unlike Bloodlines, in which you're visiting famous landmarks, this is set in its own fantasy version of Europe, where you're going through swamps, you're going through like old monasteries, visiting a prison and getting like lore about these areas. Like it's really cool and interesting to see the world of Castlevania fleshed out just a little bit for us, right? It's really cool to see other groups outside of the core cast of characters going up against Dracula, right? It's really interesting seeing Shanoa as a character develop and grow throughout. She probably has the best character arc out of any Castlevania protagonist, right? It's really cool to see like how she handles like the build up to Dracula's castle and leading up to like just a really beautiful ending. My favorite in the entire series, I think. Absolutely stunning game. Wish I could give it more praise, but unfortunately, there are two I enjoy far, far more. This is my childhood Castlevania game. This is the one that I decided to check out, that I wanted to play, that I thought looked interesting. It was on like the second copy of Nintendo Power I got with my subscription, right? I think the first was like, what was the one before that? Was it like Phantom Hourglass? No, Phantom Hourglass was later. I don't remember the first one, but I remember the second. I remember seeing the characters on like that big spread and like looking at it and reading about the game and thinking it looked unbelievably cool. Like two vampire hunters going on this journey to destroy Dracula. I had read about Castlevania in older Nintendo Powers that I was not subscribed to. So seeing a brand new game on the horizon was really, really exciting to me. And I didn't pick the game up immediately. It took me a long time to get around to it. I was definitely interested, to be sure, but it was one of those things where I'm just like, I'm not sure I can play it, or like I didn't see it in stores. Funds were limited and stuff like that. But eventually I got around to picking the game off the shelf, buying it, and initially being very disappointed because the game feels very limited. It feels very basic. It feels simplistic, right? The artwork isn't good. It felt really budget to me as a kid, and it took a long time. I think beating it several times before I really started like appreciating like what the game was trying to do and what it was accomplishing. Like the game features two different playable characters with wildly different powers and abilities that have to circumvent all of these painted worlds thrown throughout the castle, right? They essentially copied Super Mario 64. So you find a painting, you jump into it, and boom, you're in some like fantasy landscape. Uh, and you essentially travel through the fantasy, the painting, find the boss, kill it, and then you come back to the castle, right? Pretty straightforward. Again, at the time, I felt they could have done a lot more with these painting ideas. More interesting level themes. They rehashed them later on, right? There's not a lot to do in them other than like fight monsters, right? It comes off like this game could have been so much more. But as you play through it, as you master the mechanics, as you really get to know the characters and the lore and like what the game is going for, you really start appreciating just how good the game really is. And by the time that I had played Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, several years later, like 6 years or something. Like by the time I finally got around to playing it, I went back to Portrait of Ruin and I 100%ed it. I did all the quests, I beat the Nest of Evil, and I found myself just completely blown away with just how good the game actually was, with its unique combat system, with its flawless implementation of both characters. It's great boss fights, great boss art. In general, the game just absolutely oozes style, and in all is just absolutely a masterclass of the Igavania design. It's its own thing, but it still adheres to those like principles established by earlier titles, right? This was a really exciting, great time for me. But there was one Castlevania game that was far, far superior to that. I imagine that every Castlevania game is so different that everyone's going to have their own favorites, right? For most people, like, I think it's the one they grow up with, right? The one they played the most growing up, or the one they were exposed to. I'm always seeing people say Super Castlevania 4 is their favorite, or Symphony of the Night. For me, it was actually one of the later ones, right? It was something that I'd played after playing a number of other titles in the series. I believe, yeah, Portrait of Ruin, Castlevania 1, 2, 4. I had played a number of these games before, right? And so I go into Aria of Sorrow, having heard about how great it is, seeing all the accolades it's gotten, seeing it being considered one of the all-time greatest Game Boy Advance games, and years after the Game Boy Advance had left production, this became absolutely one of my favorite games on the system, if not my favorite. I'll have to like go back and check my Game Boy Advance lineup to see like how I would rank all this stuff. I haven't thought about my rank Game Boy Advance games in years, but I think Aria of Sorrow is the one that I've come back to and played the most in the past 10 years since I played this game. I remember when I first played this in 2014, and I felt that like 2035 felt so far off, but now, 10 years later, it's not feeling that far away, is it? We're actually gonna live to see the events of Castlevania Aria of Sorrow play out in real life. It's gonna be great. I really wonder if I'm gonna play through the game when that happens. But um, yeah, Aria of Sorrow really sticks out compared to most other Castlevania games because you're not playing as some crazy vampire hunter or like some witch that's been trained from birth to fight Dracula or whatever, right? You're playing as this guy, Soma, who is apparently an ordinary high school student with no real knowledge of the supernatural or fighting vampires. He is supposedly a normal person. But one day he finds himself in Dracula's castle and discovers his innate ability to conquer monster souls. And what this means is made very abundantly clear as you venture through the castle, fighting progressively stronger monsters, getting better equipment, acquiring more souls, and eventually leading up to the game's climax. Like, this is absolute peak Castlevania. When it comes to the artwork, the progression, the characters, even, right? This is the Castlevania game where I personally feel the most attachment to the extended cast, right? Shinoa as an individual protagonist might be better than Soma, but considering Soma actually has friends that he interacts with and has like dynamics with and actually has like, respect and mutual trust with a lot of them, seeing like these relationships grow and develop throughout the game, like it is very unusual for Castlevania. And it really leads into the climax of the game feeling far more impactful than it would otherwise. This game has probably the best plot twist in any Castlevania game, I would say. And when it happens, you really do feel the ramifications of what it implies for the characters. You are doomed to go along this path. And yet you are desperately trying to find a way out, desperately trying to avoid your own nature. And it is apparently completely unavoidable, but then again, maybe it isn't, right? Maybe we can figure this out. It's such a good, uplifting message that really I think goes to the very core themes of Castlevania. That old school film idea of like good always triumphing over evil, right? This is a game that takes place after Dracula is put down for good, right? In 1999. This game takes place in 2035. This is a game that really shows us that things don't really change in the Castlevania universe even after like Dracula's done, but it's also one that shows us that like there will always be hope, and that is what makes it so great.